Thank you very much for joining us today for this Energy Learning Networks webinar on heat networks and community energy. We are still having people come in, but I think what we're going to do is make a start because we've got quite a packed agenda for today. So I'm going to dive straight in and give you an introduction first on what we're planning to do over the next 2 hours. So I'm Philip Morris. I'm the program lead for the Energy Learning Network. And in terms of the plan for today, we will be having around a 2-hour session. So it's quite a long session, and apologies for trying to condense a lot into this session, but hopefully all very useful to you. We will have around a 10-minute break, close to an hour in, and 10 minutes at the end for questions. So not an ideal amount of time for questions, but that's because we've got a lot of presentations that we wanted to get in on the subject and hopefully all of interest. We're very happy to have questions during the session, but please put those in the chat. And if people can, amongst the speakers, if they're able to respond to those as we go along, then that will be brilliant. If they don't respond to your message, which they may not because they're multitasking, if you stick up your virtual hand, once we get to the Q&A session at the end, I will then work through everyone in turn and we'll address those questions. And then I will then double back and check that we picked up everything from the chat. But if you could, yes, please put up your virtual hand at the end if we haven't got your question in the chat during the session. All the presentations will be shared at the end along with an attendees pack. And as I said, we will be recording this. It will ultimately go onto the Energy Learning Network landing page. There are, as I said, a lot of presentations today. More normally, we would make time for networking. We would look to make time for breakout rooms. But actually, there's a lot to pack in here and hopefully a lot that's of interest.
Notice we're trying to go for a lovely...
Just going to mute everybody again. Right, so on to the agenda. So we're going to start with a very brief section from me on the Energy Learning Network, and also from an introduction to heat networks from Liz. And then we will have a perspective from a large council from John, from Plymouth City Council. We'll have a break, and we can all take a breather, go and get a cup of coffee. And then we'll have Oisín talking us through some of the outcomes and learnings from community groups looking at potential for heat networks in Scotland. Dave talking to the Bishop's Castle Heat and Wind project, and then Kate on a terrace street approach. So quite a broad cross-section of kind of an introduction there, and also some examples of heat network projects that are progressing. So the Energy Learning Network, I won't labour this for too long, but we've been funded by the National Lottery for 4 years to support the community energy sector. And one of the things we've been funded to do is deliver events like this across the UK, as well as country-specific events within the UK as well. And the way that we support through the Energy Learning Network is pretty broad, and that can be anything from events like today through to a mentoring programme, which we have set up, through providing toolkits and resources and making more accessible online community energy resources. So there's quite a lot that we plan to do. We're still working out a lot of it as we go along now, but key things like the mentoring programme are now launched, and we will be recruiting for mentees to support in the coming weeks. And all of it's about the partnership. So it's hopefully a useful and experienced set of organisations used to supporting the community energy sector. So we've got Community Energy England, the Centre for Sustainable Energy, Community Energy Wales, Action Renewables, Ashden, and Community Energy Scotland. So we are all working together to make the most of the independent learning that we've got about how to support the community energy sector and bring that together to provide as comprehensive and extensive as possible support for the community energy sector. So I'm not going to do any more on ELN because actually we've got a tight agenda and it will give our speakers a bit more time to talk through all the interesting stuff they've got. So our first speaker is Liz Warren from SE2 and District Heating Divas, who can give us, I hope, and I expect, a brilliant introduction to heat networks. So if you are happy to take control, Liz, that would be great.
Great. Hopefully I have. Do you know what? I was in a big long meeting before this and I said to myself, I won't say the word hopefully when I take control of the screen. I will confidently do it. And then I just said the word hopefully straight off. So hopefully you can now see, you can see the slides, and I will just go forward one, and that will all look Beautiful. So my name is Liz Warren. I'm from a company called SE2. I've been involved with heat networks since 2002. There we go, which is more years ago than I think it is. And so I have more grey hairs than there are probably heat networks. I've also been involved with the community energy sector for a number of years, doing some work on capacity building and guidance for Community Energy England, and as a director of FRECO, which is the Frome Renewable Energy Cooperative, which is Frome in Somerset, where I live. So we have a couple of PV installations, and we've also done some early feasibility work looking at microgrids, PV, wind, and a little bit of heat as well. So my job today is to give an introduction to heat networks, and I'm going to assume that people don't know anything about heat networks. So if I say stuff that you already know, great, but this is a start from the beginning, keep it simple, and let's just kind of build into the story of heat networks as we go. And Philip's going to keep me on track in terms of time, and let's see how far we get. So what's a heat network? Well, let's start with that there are already heat networks in the UK. There's about 14,000 of them, which account for about 3% of UK heat demand. Now, under government plans, that's expected to increase to somewhere around 20% of UK heat demand by 2050. So it's a big area of interest. There's a lot of policy development work that's gone into it, a lot of funding's gone into it, a lot of interest and excitement about the sector. But you go, well, what's a heat network? Simply put, a heat network is where you have one energy source, one heat source, providing heat, often heat and hot water, or heat, hot water and cooling, to multiple homes or buildings. Okay, so the vast majority of us have our own heat source. We have our own individual boiler, which provides heat and hot water to our own individual home. Heat networks have a shared boiler or a shared system providing to multiple front doors effectively. Most of the heat networks in the UK are what we commonly call communal heating. So typically a block of flats with a plant room, an energy centre within the building, maybe on the roof or in the basement, one boiler sending out heat and hot water to all the flats in that building. The other type of heat network is what we commonly call district heating, where you have one heat source, but it's sending heat and hot water to multiple buildings. And that could be a couple of homes, it could be a couple of houses in a community centre, it could be multiple blocks of flats, it could be like a housing estate, or it could be something at a much bigger scale. But these are the sorts of heat networks that we're thinking about, and this is how sort of government defines heat networks. Some of the scale thing, you know, that can go from, as I said, a couple of homes through to very large citywide heat networks, which are drawing on lots and lots of different heat sources. So they've got multiple energy centres and multiple inputs of heat into a network, which is going to different types of buildings. So it could be homes, it could be business properties, it could be health hospitals or university buildings, local council buildings, town halls, leisure centres. All of those could be connected through these networks, which are drawing heat from multiple different places. We'll hear about Plymouth in a little while from John, which is a great example of one of these where they're trying to kind of draw together multiple different heat sources to connect up multiple different types of buildings. Now, at this scale, it tends to be very urban, and you could talk about Newcastle, Leicester, Nottingham, Liverpool, lots and lots of them, major cities that have heat networks. But we also see them at different scales, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, just to sort of explain a little bit more about the types of heat networks that are out there. This slide was going to be called Why Heat Networks Are a Good Thing, and I caveated it slightly to why heat networks should be a good thing, just to kind of give a little bit of a history lesson as I go along, because the heat networks have a long history. I mean, if you want to go far back, we can talk about Romans, and we can talk about 14th century France, which comes up a lot in heat network history. But in the UK, it's pretty much a post-World War II history. with a lot of development that happened in the 60s and 70s. Philip, be on the case in the chat for a slide
Yes.
thing. I'll
So
keep
Liz,
talking.
what slide are you using, Liz? Because
I
I think mine is still fixed on the front one, and I think that might be happening for a few people.
Okay, my apologies for that. So
So
I'm
I
already
think
a few through. Shall I
think
give
what's
this
happening
back
is
to
people
you?
are seeing. So I'm going to exit Spotlight, and then I think what that should do is show your slides, because there's something happening about your slides aren't clear to everybody. So I'm just
Okay,
going to
I shall wait
see
patiently.
if that works for everyone. Okay, so there are
Yep.
some people seeing and some people aren't seeing them. So I can see a lot of I can see. So carry on, Liz. Sorry to
Okay,
interrupt you.
I
It
shall
seems
carry
like
on, but
most people
I'll
can see them. Perfect. Great. Sorry,
Yep,
Liz.
cool. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for checking. I'll read out some more. Mostly it's been diagrams so far. So we shall see how we go. So heat networks should be a good thing. The promise of heat networks really is that they deliver economies of scale, because you're doing things at scale, you're able to do them more cost effectively, and also efficiencies of scale. It's more efficient than, from an engineering perspective, to have one big boiler in a system than multiple small boilers all churning out and doing their thing. Because of those economies and efficiencies, heat networks should lead to lower prices for consumers. And lower prices for consumers means that people are more able to afford to heat their homes. So living in warmer homes, we know, has benefits in terms of better health and better outcomes for householders. Another positive of heat networks is that maintenance and management should be more responsive. If you've ever tried to call out an emergency plumber because your boiler is broken, you know that that's not always easy to do, but a kind of combined and sort of joined communal system should have contracts of performance put in place which specify how quickly things will be dealt with and responded to. And heat networks also enabled a large-scale decarbonisation of heat. And I'll talk in a minute about how the types of heat sources that have been used historically with heat networks and what we're seeing more and more coming into the fore now. But they really do offer that kind of that scale decarbonisation potentially. Historically, they've not been perfect. Even today, they're not perfect. There are as many, I'd say that there are probably more good stories about heat networks now than bad, which has swung in recent years. It used to be a sort of horror story where a lot of people were left with legacy heat networks that couldn't be controlled individually, where if you lived near the boiler room, you were very hot, and if you lived far away, you were very cold, and somewhere in the middle, you were just right. Over the last 10 years or so, there's been huge advances in the policy and regulatory side of things to try and improve this for customers. So hopefully now you can see a slide about heat networks changing. So now we have better controls, including the sorts of smart controls and smart meters that we are more used to in the kind of individual boiler type household. Individual metering and billing on a heat network is now a requirement, where you used to maybe just have it all bundled into your service charge. Now, actually, everybody gets to see how much they're using in terms of their energy and how much they're paying for it. Customer protection regulation starts next year. This has been a while coming, but we're really excited that it's coming to the sector. And it was something that the sector really wanted, because it puts heat networks on the same sort of customer protection playing field as the other regulated networks, so the gas and electricity networks. And performance standards for heat networks are coming soon as well. They're still being developed, but the idea is that if you have a heat network, it has to improve its performance over time. And that should again lead to, cost savings for consumers in the longer run as well. So the idea is to create better performing heat networks with better protection for customers at the end of the day. I'm a nerd for heat networks, so I'm going to show you some pictures of energy centres, because that's what we do in this sector. We do love a pretty energy centre, and it gives me a chance to tell a few stories. This is an image of the Tower of Light, which you may have seen if you've been to Manchester recently. It's outside Manchester Piccadilly train station, and it looks most beautiful in the sort of twilight hours when it starts to glow, and that's the effectively the big chimney coming out of an energy centre, and also a beautiful piece of architecture. I think we still have some people who can't see the screens, but hopefully we can. Philip's on the case with getting you access to these glorious pictures. And the Tower of Light, that energy centre has gas-fired heat network and CHP system underneath it, which is sending out heat and hot water to a lot of buildings in Manchester city centre. My next one, this is the Bunhill Energy Centre in Islington in North London. This is a kind of classic of the heat network sector. We're all quite fond of it. It started off as a gas network, but it's developed over time, and Islington Council, who run the network, have been really interested in how you can bring in different sources of heat to go into the network. And this actually draws up waste heat from the London Underground. So all the kind of heat and warmth that the London Underground generates naturally is kind of drawn up into the energy centre, and then used to heat hot water to go out into the heat network. This one, apologies for the blurry picture if you can see it, or apologies if you can't see it. This is the heat network in the energy centre in Gateshead in the northeast of England, which I just think is a really pretty building. And that's actually drawing heat from former mine workings into a heat pump, which then goes out and is distributed around town. And that's a really exciting project, making use of kind of underground energy resources. And then perhaps my favourite, purely for quirky personal reasons, this is the Amager energy from waste plant in Copenhagen. Denmark is really the kind of the centre of excellence of heat networks and district heating, and just in terms of its reach across a population. This quite beautiful energy from waste plant, actually the green across the top of it is a dry ski slope, and in winter a snowy ski slope. So if you wanted to go skiing in Copenhagen, that would be my recommendation to you. Now, I talked about a little bit about these being quite urban things sometimes, and it's sort of like, well, where are heat networks? Well, heat networks tend to be where there's high heat demand density. So that's lots of people who need heat or hot water or steam or cooling, and lots of people who are near to each other. So there's demand and there's density of demand. So historically, heat networks have been very much associated with the kind of big urban centres. And that's where a lot of government policy and government thinking has been. It's like, let's get the biggest bang for our buck right now by looking at those big centres. Some of the longer standing networks are in places like Leicester, Nottingham, Southampton. Some of the big developments right now are happening in places like Bristol. And as I said, we'll hear about Plymouth shortly. However, not all heat networks are in major cities. Government has recently, I almost said BEIS then, I'm such an old-fashioned girl. DESNZ has recently, or has published a thing, a map. There have been several iterations over the last decade or so, but maps of heat demand for the country. So you can see that, you can see where there is a potential for a heat network, sort of technical potential, and quite a lot of what you might think of as medium-sized towns or market towns have potential, or there are some very specific, very location-specific places where there's potential for a network. So, for example, medium-sized or market towns like Rotherham, Halifax, Solihull, Worthing have all got different networks that are popping up from different reasons. The one in Solihull, for example, which is where my mum lives, so I kind of keep an eye on it. It involves connecting a leisure centre which already has a CHP unit, a gas-fired CHP unit, to other buildings locally, including a local college and schools. We're seeing heat networks as options in some of the planning for new garden villages, urban extensions, edge of town developments. I wish the planning policy would be more proactive and positive towards heat networks and heat pumps generally, rather than, allowing allowing sort of fossil fuel heating to perpetuate. Anyway, another day. We also see examples where industrial sites that are producing a lot of heat, for example, a glass factory, are then able to connect to or be the hub of a network, because that waste heat is worth something. So they can sell that waste heat into a network. We're seeing a lot of discussion with things like data centers on the same basis as well, of waste heat from data centers being used to kind of go into networks. University and hospital campuses have a long history of having heat networks within their boundaries. I've written rural communities, and it sounds like there's going to be an awful lot. There's not many small rural communities with heat networks yet. But we'll hear some more about ideas on this, I think, later on today. And as I mentioned at the beginning, one type of heat network is the communal heating system, which is literally a block of flats with a shared boiler system. So these things don't actually have to be massive urban scale things. They can be quite discrete building level networks. It's about how many people are accessing that heat, be they residential customers or businesses or other. I talked a little bit about some of the heat sources. So where does a heat network get its heat? How does it make heat? Historically, gas was the main fuel for heat networks, just as it has been for individual heating systems in most properties. But we're now seeing a lot more innovation coming through in terms of technologies that are being used, be that heat pumps, geothermal systems. So John will probably talk about geothermal when it comes to Plymouth, but certainly the network in Southampton has been running from geothermal boreholes down into the ground for decades now. The Gateshead system and one in Dalkeith in Scotland run from mine water and mine workings. We're seeing waste heat from various different places, and we're also seeing energy from waste plants. So that there's a lot of different places that the heat can come from now, and that's part of why it's an exciting sector. It's also as with any of these technologies, it's a relatively new thing for people. So how this all fits together is still something that the industry is developing and delivering, actually, with a great deal of success right now. I wanted briefly to kind of touch on, I guess, the relationship between heat networks and community energy, because all of this, a huge amount of this is being done either by private organisations or by private organisations working with local authorities or housing associations or the public sector more generally, who have the sort of social drivers. So the local authority or the housing association has been the guardian of the sort of social drivers of heat networks. But it feels like community energy has a role to play, and communities have a role to play as heat networks become much more part of the fabric of our energy system. You'll know community energy historically has kind of focused more on power than on heat. It's more and more got involved with retrofit, and it's starting to engage with heat in different ways. But heat is the big challenge when it comes to energy. We use an awful lot more kilowatt hours trying to keep warm than we do trying to run our laptops and keep the lights on. So we need to think about heat. We need to think about heat alongside energy efficiency and retrofit, so that we're doing sensible things in terms of insulating and then heating. Hopefully I've got across that heat is quite a localized thing, and the type of heating system or heat network that you end up with will be about your place and the heat resources that are available to you locally. I've mentioned that the heat networks industry is growing rapidly. There's huge, skills needs in the sector. So if you're interested in jobs in heat networks, this is a good time. But the big thing for me is like, where does the benefit of all this work go? And there's a certain benefit that hopefully comes to a community from having a really well-run heat network delivering lower costs for users at the end of the day. But all of that kind of economic and return on investment type benefit is just kind of disappearing out to corporate providers, basically. And that's the type of model that community energy has always tried to break apart. So what kind of relationship can community energy organisations have with heat networks? Now, the presentations that you'll go on to hear after this one will give you some sort of detailed examples and a really good look at some of the options, but I just wanted to sort of set them out at this stage so you've got some things to kind of be thinking about as we go through the afternoon. So there are different options. Now there's the option which might sit most familiarly with, is that a word? With the community energy sector, which is actually community ownership or shared ownership or a shareholding in an energy project. That carries an awful lot of risk. Potentially it carries some reward, which can be then reinvested through your community funds, your community benefit funds. But ownership of a heat network, these are quite large infrastructure projects with quite a lot of complexity. But that's one option to think about. The community benefit fund, social value type provisions, what we see on the large onshore wind type developments is this sort of community benefit as a payoff. And I mean, it's great, but it could be so much more. So what if there is that community benefit funding, how can that be deployed in different ways? How can the community really decide what they want to do with it? The Bristol heat networks being developed by Bristol City Leap are amazing at this in terms of thinking about funding and social value and traditional definitions of social value around employment, but also about really engaging and empowering the community on all aspects of energy. And it's no surprise that the person driving that within Bristol City Leap is Sonia Bedford, who's been involved with the community energy sector for decades. So there's some really interesting stuff that they're doing in Bristol, looking at these models for bringing benefit to local communities from having a heat network. You might want to get involved with managing a heat network, or you might want to get a whole heat network, or you might want to get involved with managing a certain element of a heat network. So that might be customer engagement or community engagement, or, you know, almost you become a subcontractor to the heat network to deliver a specific activity. Or, as we'll hear from Dave later, you might have access to an energy input. And if you think about it, as we're moving to much more use of electric heating, so things like heat pumps, if you've got some electricity and somebody else is putting a heat pump on a heat network, you've got something that they need to run that heat pump. So these are the sorts of things you to have sort of ticking over as you're thinking about how you and your organisation might engage with heat pumps. On to my last one and a half. When I was first talking with Philip about this session, he used the phrase, "Don't frighten people too much." So I'm trying to dial back the frightening on this, but I will say this is a new territory for community energy. It is specialised, it is complicated, particularly that regulatory perspective, because there's more regulation coming in. Whereas a lot of community energy companies have not had to, they've got various agreements and rules and regulations for generating and providing energy, but it's a different kind of level of regulation and complexity. So you really need to think, if you're thinking about getting deeply involved with heat networks, what are the capacity requirements, like human capacity and human resource requirements? What do you need to know? What skills do you need to have in-house? And how much risk are you willing to carry as an organisation? And I think that sort of balance of risk and control is going to be a really interesting one for community energy organisations to think about as you go forward in pursuing heat projects. That's me. That's the wrong date, which I only realised 2 minutes before this session started, but reduce, reuse, recycle, I've used an old slide. I will stop there, and Philip, I think I'm handing straight to John, or do you want to jump in just
you
briefly?
are. That was incredibly helpful, Liz. I will jump in only briefly just to say that I think there are some quirks going on with Teams today. I myself have been kicked out twice, which is fairly unnerving as the chair. But I think most people are able to see this now. If that isn't the case, then do let me know in the chat and I will keep working on it. But thank you very much, Liz. That was a really helpful introduction. And John, if you are happy to now take control of the slides, and hopefully Teams won't have any quirks and you will just be able to pick those up from where Liz has left off and move on to your first slide. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Philip. So yeah, I'm John Selman from Plymouth City Council Net Zero Delivery team, and Heat Networks has taken up more and more of my working life recently. So I'll just go on to the next slide. So, but I've also been quite heavily involved in the past in community energy. So I am interested in the link between community energy and heat networks. So hopefully you can see my slides. I'm on slide 26. Yeah, good. It's working. So far, so good. And heat is a big issue. So in terms of, you can see the stats there, 46% of all energy used in the UK relates to heat, and that's probably industrial heat as well as heating buildings. So around 30% of UK emissions, and most of that is through burning gas. And in Plymouth's no different. 28% of our emissions relate to heating buildings. That's heating and hot water. So we've sort of looked at the potential for heat networks, and I'll come on to that. But yes, it could save a huge amount of carbon. Just the schemes that we've looked at, 31,000 tonnes per annum, which is over 3% of the city's carbon emissions. So, there's a lot of work to be done, and heat networks and communal systems can do some of the heavy lifting around that. And so just to pick up on a point in the chat, which said 20%, where does that come from? Is that achievable? So I think we're probably somewhere between 2 and 3% in the UK at the moment. So there's lots of schemes being developed, lots of activity in this space. And although that 20% figure came from all the pathways in the Climate Change Committee, what's closest to the strategy for decarbonisation, their 6 carbon budget report, all the pathways indicated showed the heat networks playing a role and supplying up to around 20% of the heat demand by 2050. So we know, and that's a big ticket item. It's been estimated to be in the region of £80 billion, which is more than offshore wind. So there's a lot of investment flowing into this sector from a variety of sources. Some of it pension funding that's got a very long, investment cycle, investment model of 40 years or so. But the interesting thing is the Climate Change Committee also pointed out this is not just about decarbonisation. They also identified this would lead to improvements in energy security, because you've got far more diversity, local sources of heat involved in those networks, and also air quality, so which I come on to. And from our perspective, we're interested in local jobs and local skills as well, very much. Social value is a big driver for a local authority. So, yeah. So we've seen quite a lot of changes in the way we heat our buildings over the years, and it's difficult maybe to remember what drove those and what those changes have looked like. And I think it's just quite interesting thinking about this, because originally, obviously, this was driven by legislation. If you remember, if any of you have watched The Crown and the bit about Winston Churchill trying to pretend the smog wasn't a problem, until one of his members of staff got run over by a bus, then you'll know about the Clean Air Acts and the fact that we've moved from burning coal in our buildings, in fireplaces, and that's been so. Change happened really quite rapidly as a result of legislation originally driven by air quality. But of course, gas is also contributing towards NOx emissions that might not be so visible, might not be creating smog, but equally that's a very significant air pollutant, particularly in cities. And the graph at the bottom shows the uptake of central heating in houses. And I'm just about old enough, I hate to admit, when I was very small, to live in a house without central heating. And my gran was probably several decades after that. Just shows how rapidly change, from buildings not having any central heating to have central heating systems, the uptake was massive over 2 decades. And I suppose that's the challenge we've got over the next 25 years. So legislation, amongst other things, can make a huge difference and drive things forward. So Liz has already picked up quite significantly about what a heat network is, but just to say, really hit one point home, which is around the principle of heat networks is that they're accessing the lowest cost, low carbon solution, and that's driving some of the legislation, zonal legislation that's coming through at the moment. And that means waste heat sources, which are there already, stable, not being utilised, are a really good source. And I've been quite amazed in Plymouth just how many significant waste heat sources there are that we can deploy. And they can have other environmental benefits associated with that. But yes, Sweden and Denmark have been down this road in the oil crisis in the 1970s, and even before that. So that they've got really extensive heat networks, and there's an awful lot we can learn from the Scandinavian countries in particular around their approach. So yeah, I mentioned legislation. Governments with the Energy Act originally gave government powers to the last government, interestingly enough, to implement heat network zoning legislation, and that's been followed through with the new government, which is nice to see that there's sort of some continuity in terms of continuing to back this approach. So, as I said, it's very much about creating zones which create certainty for investment in heat networks on the basis that it's the lowest cost, low carbon solution. And we found certain buildings, particularly in the city centre of Plymouth, you can't put an individual heat pump on. There's just not enough roof space. So sharing a heat source can be, really important technically as well as in terms of the economics. So, and the approach they're proposing leads to a raft of regulations, which they're working on at the moment. So Ofgem have already been appointed as regulator for heat networks. That's existing and new heat networks. And I'll talk about the consultation, which is ongoing, that Ofgem are leading. And there's also been consultations around the zone legislations, but effectively, the intention is that there'll be a zone developer who would roll out, be selected through a competition process, which might be run by the local authority, who would be the sort of principal developer of heat networks and operator of heat networks within an area. But there's also other aspects to this around technical standards that Liz mentioned. There are existing engineering SIBSI standards for heat networks already, but this is taking things up a notch. So this has been driven nationally and locally. It's really important in all your local areas to try to get local authorities to have supportive planning policies around this and strategies that really kind of helps. So we've had through our climate emergency declaration, and that's driven a whole range of things. So our Plymouth plan, our corporate plan, one of the 6 priorities is green investment, jobs and skills. Our net zero action plans very much refer to heat networks. Our local economic strategy, for example, talks about heat networks as well. And our joint local plan, which is our planning policy, basically has been very strong in this respect, underpinned by our sort of citywide strategy on this. So it's really important to have the policy frameworks in place on a local level if you can. So do make those points to your local authority. And so planning policies basically has to be underpinned by evidence. It has to go through an examination. And so our evidence in part was the citywide strategy. And that came up with these quasi zones in 2017. And then that was adopted in our policy. So we've been busy lining up new developments, major developments, which can connect to the network as and when that network is there, if it's not already. So, and I sort of start to talk about the benefits. So across those two zones, we've modelled schemes which we feel could be economic, of around 400 million. So it's a big investment that's needed, possibly in some cases beyond the means of community energy, but I feel community energy definitely has a role to play in this overall mix. So obviously opportunities with jobs, significant, probably one of the most impactful things we do as a local authority in terms of decarbonisation, and the zonal approach could, we feel, achieve between 3 and 5% reduction in Plymouth's carbon emissions, which kind of aligns with that 20% figure that's been mentioned before. But obviously there's also, I think, using carbon as the only commentary around heat networks is missing a trick, and air quality, energy security are also key facets to this approach. And it's really important to keep mentioning those other issues, other benefits. So on the right-hand side, you can see our joint local plan evidence base showing these zones. And then on the left-hand side in red is showing the outputs of the Department of Energy Security's national model, where they've developed a model to consider where heat network zones are. So they do mirror each other very closely. So one of the main differences is in the preliminary zones, as they're called. They also include waste heat sources, significant waste heat sources within those boundaries. But the interesting thing from a community energy approach is also you can see other brown areas where there's potential for heat networks. And so, there's a question mark. What happens outside of the zones? And what role does community energy have within or beyond those existing defined preliminary zones? And the largest zone that's shown in the previous slide in red, there's effectively the waterfront area. So this is the city centre. I'm not sure if my cursor is showing up on the screen. Maybe I can click on cursor. But anyway, it includes the densest parts and the mixed-use elements of the city centre. And a scheme's being modelled, so with government support, they've modelled what does a strategic heat network look like? And this shows a scheme which has also been tested in high-level terms economically, that is deliverable, underpinned by principally by two waste heat sources: the energy from waste plants to the north, and the wastewater treatment plant to the south. So two significant waste heat sources. That wouldn't be the end of the heat sources. Clearly, you need to build resilience into these schemes and diversity because, for example, the energy from waste plant has several weeks downtime in the summer, and there may be unplanned outages as well. So effectively, the other waste heat sources we can deploy within that scheme. So that shows the potential, and this is where we're starting. We're starting by with a reference scheme that we intend to go out to the market with next year as part of a zonal approach, which would harness some of the waste heat from the Southwest Water Plant. So, and that's an environmental good story there, because effectively what we're doing is taking waste heat out of the treated water, going back to the sound, going to the sea. So we know that the sea's heating up. it's taking heat out of the urban environment and using it in the heat network. But we're also considering, we're also trying to utilize a low temperature system that can also dump cooling. Increasingly, we're seeing cooling demand increasing, and that can be rejected back into the network and reused on other buildings for hot water demand, for example, in the summer. So waste heat recovery is another potential benefit. But obviously, heat networks don't have to only be concentrated to the really dense areas. I saw a presentation recently from Gateshead where semi-detached council housing is being linked together by a heat network that can connect to a wider heat network over time. And I also saw Liz's energy centre at Gateshead earlier, which is, I think, next to their solar farm. So at times it's zero carbon. So that's a replicable thing for community energy as well. And on the right-hand side, you can see a new heat network being delivered in a very low density area in Denmark. And this is detached housing, low density. You can see from the picture that it's very low density, and it's just one single pipe with flow and return running through it. So, let's not say heat networks can only be delivered within the zones. There may be a case to extend them into other areas as well. So outside heat networks, often the presumption is that air source heat pumps might be the primary technology. And this, I'm just trying to signpost you to a report done by Regen Southwest with Kenza a number of years ago, which basically, obviously, this has an impact upstream on the electricity grid. So and this was looking at some of the benefits of using perhaps a ground source approach rather than having a dominance of air source heat pumps. So ground source schemes are classed as heat networks as well. So it's another way of, using lower temperature, ambient type networks where you're linking up boreholes to supply heat to buildings using a water source heat pump at the interface. So, and this is just identifying, this report was just identifying some of the benefits, wider societal benefits to the electricity grid, which means you don't have to put so many, upstream reinforcement on the electricity grid. You don't necessarily have to put so much renewable electricity upstream. So actually, we need to be clever about how we apply heat pumps technology, and perhaps consider the opportunities for ground source as well, because of those wider benefits. And this is a scheme that Kens are involved in at Stithians down in Cornwall, very low density, mixture of social housing, and I think this slide might be repeated later on, but also including private housing. So it's, where they put the boreholes in the streets, and really good responses in terms of the feedback from the scheme. Effectively is a heat network, but instead of, as you can see from this smaller insert image, instead of having an external air source heat pump, you might have an internal or external water source heat pump at the building interface. And that's just showing Coastline, one of the housing associations connected, and that they've really used air source heat pumps in before, but they very much believe that's a really good solution, as you can see. And this is an example of a Kenza type shoebox externally in a cabinet, just to show how small those water source heat pumps can be. So community energy. Swathen Prior's mentioned quite a bit, and really on the LPG many of these buildings in the village were heated by in Cambridgeshire. And it's been through a bit of a journey, and it's using a mixture of air source, ground source, and electric boilers. So there is diversity in that heat network. And it's interesting, I think, learning from that approach, because there's quite a lot of resistance from some people, and during that process arising from disruption or people being skeptical about the change. But it's interesting to see that I don't know if anyone's on the call from Stratham Prior who's been involved in it, but even the sort of worst critic of the scheme on social media wants to join the scheme. And the interesting thing is seeing the ripple effect. The adjoining villages also want to have similar schemes now. So that's really where we want to be, where it's not seen as something new, but it seems when can we have this rather than what is this and what's this mean for us. And I think Rossendale are also on the call later on, so I won't say anything about that particularly now if it's going to be repeated. But clearly there's a role for community energy, where particularly in constrained sites where air source heat pumps are quite problematic in terms of space or noise, for example. So there's a parliamentary call for evidence at the moment about unlocking community energy, and with reference to the local power plan. But in that's a call for evidence, it actually identifies that community energy typically involves people collaborating with others in local to generate low carbon heat and electricity. So that was music to my ears to see that actually. And I think actually maybe you can engage with that call for evidence and give, if you're aware of heat schemes, but certainly there's scope for community energy to be involved in that. Maybe as part of the local power plan. It'd be interesting to see what the government's proposals are around that. And yeah, clearly there's some challenges and opportunities ahead. Social housing is a good place to start. Certainly in Plymouth, we found that they have a preference for ground source because of the long-term benefits, lower costs to their tenants. There's some challenges there, but it's always good you get some scale with social housing, so that's a good way to anchor initial schemes. There are some challenges where you've got flats with individual gas boilers. How do you link those up to a network? There is some potential funding routes that can help warm homes. What was social housing fund can pay for costs towards connection. How am I doing for time? Almost there. There's also challenges around metering billing for which might be a challenge for community energy. There is a way around that. So in terms of things like customer facing, managing debt, billing customers, that sort of stuff can be challenging. That's regulated as well. But in some cases that's been overcome with ground source heat pump schemes where, effectively the heat customer pays the electricity bill for the heat pump, and there's a simple standing charge arrangement for connection to the network. And the lower cost finance that can be provided, perhaps through community energy for those sorts of schemes, the lower cost that can be for the consumer as well. So the length of the term of the investment, longer that is, and a lower cost source of finance can make a huge difference to the cost to consumer. And actually new regulations are coming in. Say Ofgem has been doing a number of sessions around that. And whilst ground source type communal schemes will come under regulations, I think they're proposing a lighter touch with these sorts of ground source schemes, particularly community energy, but it is worth you engaging in that process if you feel you want to or can. So back to Philip. Hopefully you're on time.
Thank you very much, John. You are exactly on time. So thank you very much, Liz and John. So Liz first for a really comprehensive introduction, and also John for bringing it to life in the context of Plymouth. We now have 10 minutes break to go and grab a cup of tea and just stretch your legs before we have 3 more fascinating presentations on actual community energy examples that are being developed. I should also say thank you very much, everybody who's really active in the chat. I think you are managing to, within the audience, answer each other's questions as well, which is brilliant, as well as Liz actively responding on there as well. So if everyone now could head off, have a cup of tea, stretch your legs, and then if you could be back by just before 4:05, we will pick up and start the presentations just at 4:05. So thank you very much, everybody. Chance to stretch your legs. I will see you back shortly. Ah. Oh. Hello, everyone. So hopefully everyone will be working their way back from getting the tea and coffee now and stretching their legs. And we will shortly be moving into the next part of the session. I'm hoping one of those people who've found their way back is Oisín, our next speaker. Oisín, once you're back, if you can turn your camera on, that'd be great. And I know you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready. Phillip, whenever.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay, so hopefully most of you are back now. So next we have a presentation from Oisín, who's going to talk about the community heat development program and some experiences of community energy and heat networks that have come out of that program. So Oisín, if you are happy to take control of the slides, and yes, we're ready for you now. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks very much, Phillip. So, hello everyone. My name is Oisín Priall. I'm a senior consultant in Reheat. We are a low carbon heating consultancy based in Northumberland. And we are delivering the Community Heat Development Programme on behalf of Scottish Government and Local Energy Scotland. So a bit of background and context to the project first. The aim is to support community organisations and householders to develop their ideas for locally generated low carbon heating projects. It's funded by the Scottish Government under the CARES scheme, so Community and Renewable Energy Scheme, and it runs from October 2022 till March 25. So we're coming near to the end of the programme. It's closed to new applications at the minute, so we're finishing off the work that we've been delivering. So, like I said, it's administered by Local Energy Scotland. The technical expertise on the project is delivered by Reheat, who I work for. And the scope is limited to feasibility activities, but there's a couple of different phases to that. So we carry out an initial review to kind of identify showstoppers to see if there's any reason why this project shouldn't move forward. If it moves to feasibility stage, then we offer 10 days consultancy support, kind of investigating the solution provided by the community or offering up one that we've identified. Then there's scope for additional support, what we've been calling stage 3, to give additional bespoke support to each project that meets the criteria and is dependent on what the project is. So for some of them, it is a business case. For others, it might be a bit more detailed design work.
Oisín, sorry to cut in on you. The sound is quite poor. I don't know if you're able to turn off your camera or anything else you've got running on your laptop, because we're struggling to hear you. And indeed, if anyone else has their camera on, just to give us the best possible chance of success, please turn that off. So we can hear you, Oisín, but it is breaking up a bit.
Yeah, I'll try to turn everything else off. Okay, so
sorry to interrupt your flow.
No, you're fine. So the focus of the program is on learnings. So we try to identify what are the barriers to community heating at this stage, and then feed back them learnings to Scottish Government so that they can put the appropriate measures in place to overcome them barriers. We all know community heat is still very new, so we're trying to identify what works and what doesn't, and why that might be. So I'll move on. So this is the journey that community groups go through. So we kind of do an initial review, which is a Teams call with the group. We make a short report, then Local Energy Scotland do an appraisal, where if it passes the appraisal process, we move to a feasibility study stage, a site visit, for 10 days consultancy support, and they then get a detailed report on their project. So that is looking at the ownership options, the carbon savings, potential capital costs, and policy that is appropriate for that group. Then we offer the group afterwards a 1 hour meeting or approximately 1 hour to explain the content of the report in case there's any questions. And if it meets the criteria, like I said, we move then to further stage 3 additional support, which is bespoke depending on the project.
Oisín, just to let you know, I've taken back control of the slides just to see if it improves the sound that's coming through. So just let me know when you want to move on to the next slide. You ready for the next one?
Yeah, so who could apply? It was informal groups of householders or constituted community groups. It must be community-led, but non-domestic premises can be included in the projects. It does not need to ultimately result in a purely community-owned project. So it could be that it's part-owned or that private investment owns the entire project. There's a load of different types of examples of projects that we've dealt with to date. These include groups of householders collectively purchasing air source heat pumps, groups of neighbours in a shared block of flats that are considering installing a shared heating system, or heat networks. I'll speak in a bit more detail now, that can supply either a couple of houses or the whole village or town. And the technologies that we are interested in, any heat technologies, so the community can suggest one if they think they know an appropriate solution to decarbonise their heating, and if not, Reheat will advise on what we think the best and most appropriate solution for them would be. The main focus of the programme is on community heat, but we will look at energy technologies such as solar PV, where it complements the heat project, such as providing electricity to run a heat pump or similar. Next slide then, Philip.
Oisín, it is a little better. If you happen to have a headphone on or anything that you could disconnect, then it is breaking up quite a lot. We can mostly hear you, but just in case there's anything you can change in terms of your headphone setting. But otherwise, we'll do our best and I'll keep moving through the slides.
Yeah. So this is a map to show the locations of some of the projects, or this is all the projects I think to date. So it just shows that they're all over Scotland, right up in Thurso, down to Dumfries and Galloway. A good cohort of them are in Glasgow and Edinburgh. So there's more than one dot on each of them. Next slide. So like I said, we're coming to the end of the programmes. But 32 community heat projects have been helped along the programme. Some of the ones that are currently in progress that we're actively working on are rural 15-house cluster off gas, looking at district heating, rural village looking at waste heat resource for district heating in Fife, town on an island looking at a heat network opportunity in a conservation area, biomass district heating network in Thurso, connecting to both domestic and non-domestic users. A tenement building in Glasgow, looking to review the title deeds to allow communal ground source heat pump solutions to take place. Or 84 flats in a block in Edinburgh with a combination of aging gas distribution system and direct electric, looking to completely decarbonise and find an alternative appropriate solution. So it just shows there's a very wide range of projects, like from the small rural up to the middle of cities. So the first one is Warmly. I think Brian is on the call from the community group. So this is a really exciting project where we've made it through to the stage 3 stage of the program. So initially we gave them essentially an options appraisal of what the decarbonising solutions could be for the project. So it's approximately 500 houses, a mix of social and privately owned, with some large non-domestic users as well. So there's the university campus, there's the NHS Dunbar and the local high school, and then a mix of small industrial units as well. We've to give them an options appraisal for a biomass district heating scheme, ground source heat pump solution, and then the counterfactual to all these projects is individual air source heat pumps to understand does the heat network stack up against them. Because of the scale of this scheme, we couldn't look at the capital cost in the initial stage 2, but as part of the stage 3 program, that's what we're investigating and looking at the economic impact if the larger heat network, if the larger users don't connect to the heat network to form that base load, could there still be a viable business case to develop the network? Some of the early learnings for this one are that biomass district heating scheme that the community are interested in investigating further has a strong potential to offer lower cost to the users of the network, so it's the domestic users. And that's because a large proportion of them are on direct electric heating, which is the most expensive form. So by connecting to a network, they have a very strong potential of being able to pay less. And we've been engaging with the Highland Council to try and include this project in their next development plan, which will help it go through the planning process a bit easier if it's seen as a viable solution. So it's a very interesting project, and hopefully we'll be able to continue working on it and developing it in the coming years. Next slide. Another example of a project then, so Greenock in Inverclyde. So this is a tenement building looking to install a communal air source heat pump. They were in the first national assessment of potential heat network zones, they were included in it. So if they didn't do anything, a heat network would potentially be built and brought to them. And they weren't aware of this. So it's always important to talk to your local LHES officers to discuss what the likely decarbonisation route for you would be, because it might be that a heat network would be built for you. In our feasibility study, we looked at that heat network development for them. So we engaged with Inverclyde County Council. We looked at an alternative ground source heat pump solution. And then again, the individual air source heat pump counterfactual. It could be that the solution we have come up with, and I think Casper is on this call as well, who work closely with in developing heat pump solutions, that could become part of the district-wide heat network that is being developed. So we're going to feed back this information to Inverclyde Council to try and influence their decisions. So next slide. Another interesting project, so this is capturing waste heat in Stirling. So the community came to us with the idea of capturing waste heat from a local distillery and wastewater treatment plant in the village. It's a viable project, technically viable in terms of capturing the waste heat from the distillery. The distillery are on board and interested. They are open to engaging with the community group to provide this waste heat to them. It's significantly lower carbon impact from capturing that waste heat. And again, this project has moved through to stage 3 process where we're looking at in detail, engaging with the distillery and how much the cost would be, to what kind of changes would the distillery need to undertake to allow that waste heat to be captured into a local district heat network. So it's important to understand that the distillery is crucial in the early development of the network. Any efficiency upgrades that they may take place may impact on the level of heat available from them, but it's not detrimental to development of the project, because once the heat network is developed, other sources of waste heat could then be included, like the wastewater treatment plant, or even capturing heat from the river that's very close to them. So it's important that communities understand that they're very well placed to identify local resources. So if you know of large industries in your local community, you'd be best placed to identify them as potentially part of your solution. Next slide. Another one, again, completely different, is a farmsteading in East Lothian. This one's interesting because they came to the program with a very specific technology choice. They wanted to use shared batteries to power direct electric heating, and while it's a viable solution, we wondered why they came with such a specific solution, and we suggested to them to carry out an options appraisal to look at what the alternatives could be. They could be decarbonised using air source heat pumps or individual air source heat pumps or other similar technologies, but we thought we can compare what they want to look at with these other solutions, and it would be good learning for the community heat development programme, because it might be that shared batteries and a large solar farm in the field next door might actually be the best solution, and then that could be something we recommend to other communities that are in similar rural farmsteadings. I think next slide. And then I think this is the last project. I've nearly finished my time anyway. So this is an interesting one because they have an existing communal heat network in their building that's managed by a factor. So property factors are very common across Scotland. This was a communal wood pellet heating system, but they had poor engagement with the factor and they weren't exactly sure what they were paying for. So part of the recommendation from Reheat was to learn about the heat supply contract arrangements that could be put in place to make sure that the community better understand exactly what they're paying for, and to have management of the system, because currently they're paying excess fees for late deliveries. So yeah, it's just interesting that it's completely different to the other projects. And then I think there's only one slide left, Philip. Yeah, so essentially this has been a whistle-stop tour of some of the projects that are in the programme, and there is, like I said, 32 in total. We're coming very near to the end of the project, so we will disseminate much more of the learnings come start in March, end of February, and it will be open to all members of the public, anyone interested in community heat. So we'll be able to share the invite to that meeting, and we'll be able to talk much more about this programme at that stage. But thanks very much for letting me speak today, and apologies for the poor quality of my internet connection.
Thank you very much, Oisín, and I'm glad we stuck with it because there's some fascinating projects in there. And thank you everybody for kind of bearing with us on some interference with the sound. So I'm hoping we're not going to have any glitches when we now hand over to Dave Green, who is taking control. Fantastic, and ready to talk for you about Bishop's Castle Heat and Wind Project. I'll hand over to you, Dave.
Yeah, good afternoon all. I'm going to whiz through these. There will be some detail on the slides I'll have to miss out, but you'll get the slide pack afterwards so you can explore them more deeply. So Bishop's Castle Heat and Wind Project. I'm also going to briefly mention the Community Heat Development Unit if I get time at the end. So I'm a project manager at Share Energy, and I'm also treasurer of Shropshire and Telford Community Energy. So I have two hats on with this project. Share Energy, Shrewsbury-based co-op, helping people on community energy schemes across the UK, from feasibility right through to running existing schemes. And Shropshire and Telford Community Energy is Community Benefit Society, which owns and runs a 10 megawatt solar farm near Whitchurch in Shropshire. So we start with the idea of a heat network in Bishop's Castle in 2021. We were actually started off looking at a smaller sort of ambient loop scheme, but with the end of the non-domestic renewable heat incentive, we started looking at a larger, more centralised network. We gained some initial grant funding, which covered a wind constraint study, an initial heat network study, a questionnaire and a public meeting. And basically we found that a heat network could be viable, but only if renewable energy was used to power the heat pumps. And the wind study gave us 2 potential sites for a wind turbine. We spent 2.5 years trying to get permission, to ask for permission for the wind turbine. We finally got that in August last year. And of course, July this year, that requirement was abolished when the government changed the planning guidance. But anyway, it was a useful experience. I think it got the plan well known. We had to go and talk to the council numerous times, and when it came up with the idea of getting it in the local place plan rather than the neighbourhood plan, which was the obvious route, the town council gave us unanimous support. So we now have that permission to ask for permission for a wind turbine. This decision opened up further funding, including we got 100k from the Community Energy Fund earlier this year. So Bishop's Castle, fairly compact town, around 600 houses, 2 schools, a swimming pool, theatre, etc. Completely off the gas grid. Most of the properties are heated by oil or LPG with some electric. And the centre of the town, as you can see here, is older properties, solid walls. A lot of them are listed. Very difficult to do sort of holistic whole house retrofit, and very little space for fitting air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps on an individual basis. So that so the idea is to, that's the shared loop scheme that we looked at previously. So we started looking at a larger scale heat network covering a minimum of 100 houses, but also very much with the anchor loads of the leisure centre and the community college. You might see that we're not even looking at the west side of the town. The reason for that is that there are already quite a few heat pumps in there. The local housing association have been very proactive in fitting heat pumps. So there's not much point in putting a heat network down the street where half or more of the houses have got heat pumps already. So we're interested in a just under 1 megawatt wind turbine that would be around 54 meters to the hub, 80 meters to the tip. So this is considerably bigger than anything that's in the local area at the moment, but relatively small by today's standards. You know, we're talking about 150 meters, 230 meters to the tip these days for larger scale wind turbines. And the Lawrence Western wind turbine, for comparison, is just over 4 megawatts. So we've got a site just southeast of the town, and it's not an ideal wind site. We're sort of halfway up the hill rather than at the top of the hill. And it is just inside the area of outstanding natural beauty, but it means it's close enough to the town for us to run a cable back. And because we're taking 1 unit of electricity, 1 unit of energy out of the wind and converting it to 3 or 4 units of heat, it can work. And having it in that location means we're reasonably hopeful that we can get it cleared, even though we're just inside the AONB. Whereas if we went to the top of the hill, we probably wouldn't. That's just a quick. We've done some landscape visual impact assessment studies. Interestingly, we've had 3 public meetings, and we had a few objectors to the wind turbine idea initially when we had 2 sites. But at the last public meeting and the last stall we had in the square, we had no opposition to the wind turbine at all. It was basically get on and do it. Why haven't we got 2? So the discussion was about the detail of the heat network, you know, and particularly around standing charges and everything. So the whole idea is that people will get rid of their oil boilers and their oil tanks, and we can get carbon savings for those taking part of around 85% initially. It's not 100% because we will have some oil boilers for backup and top up. If you go for 100% net zero, then the costs rise quite considerably. But hopefully in the future, we'll be able to swap the oil boilers out and put electric boilers in when the price of electricity compared to the price of oil has dropped, which we expected to do so. So similar to Swaff and Priall, as I already mentioned, except that Swaff and Priall don't have a wind turbine. They have connection to a solar farm, which is all very well, but it doesn't give you as good a fit. You know, the advantage of a wind turbine is it's generating electricity when we most need it. And Swaff and Priall is actually, although it was community led, it's actually owned and run by Cambridgeshire County Council. So it's not actually community run. So we've had significant support for the project. We had a public meeting in just about 18 months ago, which actually got on to Channel 4 with Hugh Fernie Whittingstall. And the work on this project to date has been funded through Shropshire and Telford Community Energy, with help from some money from the Next Generation Grant for Power to Change and the Community Energy Fund. Have I forgotten to say anything? Yes, I have. So basically, we've got the wind turbine, we've got about 500 kilowatts of PV, we've got thermal storage, basically very large hot water tanks, so that we're maximising the use of the renewable energy, and we're only importing energy from the grid when we've really had a period of no wind and no sun. And we've also hoped to sell electricity to the leisure centre as well, so that we would minimise our export to the grid as well. Right, so I'm going to move on. And Share Energy have also been working on a project called the Community Heat Development Unit for just over a year now. And this arose partly because we had quite a lot of people, mostly in quite small rural villages, coming to us and saying, oh, we'd really like a heat network. And unfortunately, in most small rural areas, a heat network, it's very difficult to make it viable. Without those anchor loads and without that density of development. I know the previous speaker was talking about you can do heat networks in lower density areas. Yes, you can, but you know, a lot of the cost is actually in the pipe work. So the more pipe work you have to have per property, the costs are bound to rise. So and having anchor loads takes some of the pressure off having to get a very high proportion of households signed up. So we started this Community Heat Development Unit, and I think Ben Cunnell, who's been working on it, is actually on this call as well. So you might want to chip in if I say anything that's Ben spent a long time reviewing existing low carbon heat networks and community-led feasibility studies. We did some site visits to Rocks Green, which is a biomass heat network operational in just outside Ludlow, and also to look around the Bishop's Castle project. And then we've basically been doing some modelling on what the variables that might make a heat network viable or not viable. Put this into a technical economic model, and so you look at heat density, we look at building density, we look at the options for wind turbine sites and solar sites, and we come up with a sieving map which looks something like it's still evolving, so it might end up looking slightly different than this. It is looking something like this, so that, and this will be publicly available so people can have a look and see if by our assessment whether a heat network might be viable in your area. Now, a lot of this is using online data, which you know, might be right, but it might not be. So it might well be that where somebody goes and looks at a local area and says, well, actually, you know, you obviously got a heat network area here because of this high, you know, a high heat user, but actually they've just gone bust and the site's being decommissioned and turned into housing and stuff like that. So this is very much a first look at the scheme, and then when we get to look more closely at a local area, then we can use more detailed knowledge to refine the areas and have a closer look and see whether they're viable or not. I mean, it might be that, you know, we found sites that might have wind turbines on, but you know, there's lots of other constraints that we probably haven't been able to identify at this stages. So it's getting that the first pass, and then we need to refine it from there and rule out some of these sites and work on the ones. So we've been working on modelling and site selection. We're connecting with community groups at selected sites. So a call went out from Community Energy England, who are partnering with us on this. And I think something like 24 community groups came back, and we're selecting 4 of those to be case studies for the next stage of the work. And we're also looking at refining heat network specification, particularly with March's Energy Agency, who are modelling the possibility of fabric upgrades, which see how they fit in with the whole scheme. And we're also looking, we've got basically 18 months funding for this project, so we're looking at a community heat development unit business model, so a business model for the unit itself, so that we can carry on and continue this work for the years ahead. So that's just about me. I've taken under 15 minutes, so there's contact details, and I'll move on to Kate, I believe.
Thank you, Dave. I can see Kate's joined us now. There is a question for you in the chat, Dave. If you don't get a chance to answer it, then we'll pick that up in the Q&A session at the end.
Yep.
But Kate, if you were here, hopefully you should have a button at the top of your screen which says take control, which will allow you to pick up the slides and unmute yourself. And we're ready for you now if you are.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Philip. And thanks, Dave. Really interesting as ever. Can you see my screen? Sorry, I'll just bring that on. Can you see? There we go. Hold on. Let's go.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Great, thank you. So I'm Kate Gilmartin, and my day job is Chief Executive Officer at the British Hydropower Association. But I'm also a volunteer director with Rossendale Valley Energy, and also a volunteer director with Community Energy England. So I've got a renewable energy background, but I've also been working in the community energy space for well over a decade now. So I'm going to talk about our Net Zero Terrace Street project, and it says up in the corner there, Utility Week Awards finalist. We actually won the award last night, so that was exciting. And this is work we're doing with Electricity North West. So basically, this is Rossendale in Lancashire, a very typical village in Lancashire, a deindustrialised mill town, which has considerable fuel poverty, and the housing stock is quite old and inefficient. So yeah, some of the worst housing stock in the UK. Also, 30% of homes are terraced homes, and as Dave said a minute ago, the issue with terraced homes is they don't really have space for an air source heat pump. So we set up Rossendale Valley Energy a couple of years ago now, looking at developing a whole system, one-touch approach to decarbonise terraced communities. And this started through a grant for Community Renewal Fund, and it looked at three different things. It looked at what potential renewable energy projects we could bring forward in terms of community-owned energy generation, and we also looked at how can you decarbonise the terraced streets. And we also looked at finishing off a Grade 1 listed building that was undergoing a full retrofit, and which is now a co-working space, and upstairs are apartments for care leavers. So we think our solution is relevant to 14,000 homes in Rossendale, all of which are in high indices of multiple deprivation areas. We have now got 8.5 full-time equivalent colleagues in the Community Benefit Society. We are volunteer board members, so we have 4 board members who are volunteers and another 2 volunteers as well. And we are solely grant funded. We are on 2 grant funds presently, and they both have funding dates which end next year. So we are working really hard to look at funding streams, but also creating a sustainable business model. So as I said, the problem is you've got a lot of terrace homes. There's actually 6 million 2 to 3 bed terrace homes in the UK. And the thing is about 2 to 3 bed terrace homes is they have a really small footprint, which means that putting an air source heat pump somewhere is going to be difficult, not only from a cost perspective, but from a space constraint. I mean, you can put one in the backyard, but what I always say is, how efficient is that going to be with some bikes propped against it, with some footballs kicked against it, and possibly some leaves sucked up against it as well. So what we're trying to do is create a long-term solution that actually is efficient, but also sustainable in terms of that longevity as well. We've heard quite a bit about centralised heat networks. We did look at what that could look like in this area, and actually there's potential for mine water heating as well, but there isn't, again, like Dave said, there's just not a big heat load, and you really need that anchor heat load to bring forward a centralised heat network, because they're very expensive in terms of development finance. You have to find the land, you have to do the design, you have to get the planning permission, and that's all upfront at risk. And then, that's the reason you have the anchor tenant, is to basically underpin your business case, which is much harder to do in domestic setting. So really the only alternative for these terrace homes, and we are seeing this happen with private rented sector, is to put electric boilers in. And it's happening in the private rented because they're cheap to put in, but obviously they're really expensive to run, and they're not great in terms of load on the grid. If you start thinking that these streets on gas are going to go to electric boilers, that's considerable load on the grid at peak time. And again, this work we've been doing with Electricity North West is to look at that problem. Also, if you can't put an air source heat pump in, then you're not going to be able to access the boiler upgrade scheme, and you're unlikely to be able to put a ground source heat loop in on your own. So many of these homes are not going to be able to pass through the boiler upgrade scheme and take that grant funding. And we know from the work we've done in the area that there's also really low uptake of HUGS grants. And this is a problem we've got. The people that actually need it don't actually get the money to enable them to have healthy, warm homes. And obviously the funding that has come through for retrofit, it's either the able to pay or it's the social housing. And they're doing fantastic work in social housing. They're doing shared ground loops, they're doing decarbonised heat, they're doing fabric retrofit. And really what this project is about is taking that learning and applying it to mixed tenure streets. So we are, we are trying to be the aggregator like a social housing provider would be. And I think the other point as well is that currently there isn't a planned approach for street by street, and what we say is actually, we've seen this happen with broadband. Other areas will get left behind, especially rural areas that already got left behind with broadband. So it's really important from a policy perspective that we speak to government to say, look, these are the people that need it first and fastest, and actually they're currently the ones that are going to get left behind. So also part of the wider problem is obviously energy affordability. Poor quality housing, damp, cold homes leads to poor health outcomes. So a lot of our engagement work has been through health professionals who absolutely get the fact that health and housing are part of the same. Yes, both problems are on the same side of the coin. So, and the spark gap, which is a really big inhibitor for uptake in heat pumps, which is basically that you've got a big differential between the cost of gas and the cost of electricity when you're doing your heating. So what we're saying to government is, this needs to be part of a social programme of change. And often we kind of refer to the fact that, these houses had outside toilets until the 60s and 70s, and in some cases in the 80s. And it was a social programme of change that was brought forward to enable those outside toilets to become indoor toilets because it became socially unacceptable. And we should really push our politicians to say, well, it's socially unacceptable to have cold, damp homes. So we should be able to have affordable energy and healthy, warm homes. Part of obviously our model and part of the issue we've had with retrofit is the issues around the supply chain and the jobs and skills. And we've had a really big issue, think going back to the Green Deal, you've had the boom and bust of grants and policy changes, and a lot of people have got their fingers burnt. So what we're trying to do is provide a model that will hopefully get to be non-grant dependent, which will give confidence and certainty to the supply chain that they can see that mobilisation happening without the boom and bust of grant funding. So they can then build their supply chain, their local supply chain, and those local jobs and skills, which we're going to need a lot of. And that's the point is, as well, as I've said, it's got to be an investable business model to move us away from grant dependency. So just in terms of the solution, the key is that we are trying to create a standardised, modular, whole systems, one-touch, community-centric approach. So it kind of does what it says on the tin. And why we're doing this with terrace housing is because generally, all houses are different. It's going to be nuances between terraces on the same street, but we can essentially create a foundational model that means that we can have a standardized modular model, and then we can tweak that accordingly. But also, you've got diversity across that street as well. So basically, that's the general point here is that rather than start with a top-down framework, but you've got multiple variables. We're trying to remove as many of those variables as possible by saying what needs to happen in this house and what needs to happen within these streets. So we're looking at obviously fabric retrofit, but we're not doing deep retrofit. We're doing retrofit to bring the heat load of the house down to meet the heat pump, which is a shoebox, Ken's a shoebox 5.8 kilowatt heat pump. And that has to include the repairs as well. So we've got to be able to put solar on roofs and the roofs are fit for purpose. And really it's about creating an optimized building envelope as well, because these houses are essentially going to become part of the energy system for 40 years within this kind of business model. So we're looking at shared ground loops, which are basically 150-metre boreholes that go in the street. And we expect one borehole to have a heat load of about 12 kilowatts, which should be enough to do 2 terraced homes. Obviously, different geology gives different results. 150 metres in one area, it might be 100 in another area, it might be 200 in another area. And essentially those are linked together across a cluster. And that gives you, again, that kind of diversity across that cluster. And they are then obviously linked to a heat pump in the home, smart water cylinder, radiators, pipework, solar panels. And the key is that everything that goes into the house is part of the smart system and becomes part of the smart local energy system. So each home will have a home energy management system, which will control all their smart system and all their smart kit within the house. But then that home energy management system will talk to a community energy management system aggregator, so kind of a cloud-based aggregator. And that will sit next to a digital twin, which sits next to the grid or the transformer at the substation. So essentially what we're trying to do is optimize and balance behind that transformer in terms of where those electrons need to go. So we're not creating constraints upstream of the transformer. And this is the work we're doing that we won the award for last night with Electricity North West. And I think a really key point, I don't know whether anybody has looked at the Clean Power 2030 report that was went from NESO, the National Energy Systems Operator, to DESNZ a couple of weeks ago. But they've got 2 pathways there. One is high renewables and high flex. And within that high flex scenario, they want to see at least 12 gigawatts of demand side flexibility. And what we're saying to them is actually, well, if you decarbonise 6 million terrace homes, that gives you about 12 gigawatts of demand side flexibility, which is enormous. And just comparative, if we were going to do that in pump storage hydro with my day job hat on, that's actually would cost about £30 billion. I've got a bit of background noise there. But I think the point here is that people who can afford the EV, the solar, the storage, and an Octopus Agile tariff, they're paying about 12 pence per kilowatt hour for their energy right now. Whereas the people who can't afford energy are paying about 33 pence per kilowatt hour, and they can't access that kit because of the expense. So what we're trying to do is get that kind of benefit of flexibility, and not just flexibility now in terms of Octopus Agile tariffs, but if we think about how the grid is getting powered by more and more intermittent renewables, and why that demand side flexibility is so important, the value of flexibility will go up. So what we're trying to do is try and ring fence the benefit of that future flexibility to return it to the householder. So for now, but also for the future as well. And we've got to overcome this spark gap. So really what we have to do is have that flexibility returned to the householder to overcome that spark gap. We need the economies of scale to overcome that spark gap as well. But we also need a local energy market as well. So we're looking at doing a couple of solar co-ops. We're feeding that generation into the local energy market as well. So how we're working is essentially we are creating demand. So the idea is that we are providing a solution that we want to pull people towards this solution, and we want them, and we talk to them about affordable energy in healthy, warm homes. We call it Net Zero Terrace Street when we're going for funding applications, but actually on the streets, it's just fairer warmth. And it's Rossendale Valley Energy, the Community Benefit Society, that wants to bring affordable energy in healthy, warm homes to Rossendale. So I think that narrative is really important, because we know that net zero as a concept can be very divisive. We're working with Centre for Energy Equality, and we've been kind of co-developing the Fairer Warmth app or platform. And really, that's a customer relationship management system, and it's there for people to download, and it gives energy advice. But it also is there to collect data as well, so we can get people to upload their energy data, and then we can also get them to ask for an energy assessment, and we can then put in the U values, etc., into the Fairer Warmth app. And that kind of pulls through the data. It starts off with, either parity data or EPC data. And basically, we improve the granularity of that data through our energy champions, through people putting that data into the app. And that feeds through to a building energy model, which feeds into a techno-economic model, which feeds into a financial model. And the key is that we want this to be an investable proposition. So the quality of the data and the confidence within that data is really key to create that investable model. This has to be at no upfront cost to householders. So we're basically pinning the debt onto the infrastructure. So the debt of the fabric retrofit and the smart system all sits on the borehole, and it's wrapped up into a single standing charge, which is part of your connection agreement. The key is that it is a community-based model where the asset ownership is within the community ownership as well. And that's really important for a number of reasons, but fundamentally, people have to trust that this is for them, and they have ownership of it. I think we've got our fingers burnt in terms of our assets in the UK being sold on, the water industry, etc., and our bills going up. And we have to say to people that their bill isn't going to go up by 600%, like the water industry, for example. So it has to be a kind of community-based, non-profit extractive model. And again, that's really important in terms of the spark gap as well. It's got to be a deep trust model. And where we want to get to is to have stable annualized bills. So really kind of insulating people from the energy crisis that we had in 2022, and giving people certainty over their bills. So ideally what we'd like to do is have a monthly stable bill. So you're not paying more in winter than you are in summer, for example. But that at the moment, that's not in our business model. It's just something that we aspire to. I think I'm kind of said about the investable business model. I mean, essentially what we're creating is a new infrastructure asset class, and it's buried, therefore it's safe. So anything that goes in the house is owned by the householder, including the solar. But obviously the infrastructure in the street is owned through a community model, but basically we are getting asset infrastructure funding for that. That's the plan. There will be iterations of our business model until we get to non-grant dependency. At the moment, our financial model states that we have about a project IRR of 1.5% to 2%, which obviously isn't going to get the pension funds out of bed. But we need to have injection of grant funding, stroke subsidy, and even we're looking at tapered subsidy to talk to Treasury and government to say this is what it's going to cost, but this is how it tapers, and this is what the end product is. We've got to obviously build the confidence, like I said, in the supply chain. We've got to avoid that boom and bust of grants. We've got to get the economies of scale. And also we're being very prescriptive to government in terms of what we need from them to unlock this market. And what we're saying at the moment is, there are options for people who are able to pay, able to play. But at the moment, there are no options really for people in these streets that haven't got the finance, haven't got the space. And currently they're locked out of that transition. These are just kind of the moving parts. So I won't go to this diagram, but it's just to try and highlight that we've got, kind of the physical infrastructure is all wrapped up over here in the green. So that's basically everything that goes in the house, the retrofit and the bureholes. And then underneath here is how you have to create the demand for the solution, because it doesn't matter how good your solution is. If people don't want it, then we're not going to get anywhere. So it's how we do that with our community champions, with the Fairer Warmth app, building our reputation, the energy advice we're giving. Over on the right, you've got what we call the virtual infrastructure. So that's all the smart system and how that integrates across the houses and then interfaces with the grid. In the middle is all the organisational governance, and that's what we're really working on in the Pathfinder 2 project, which is through Net Zero Living. How everything sits together, hangs together, is contracted, where the data flows are, where the GDPR needs to sit. And then all this kind of flows up to the top into the energy model, and then into the techno-economic model, the financial model, which is obviously where we have to get the investment. So those are kind of the moving parts of the puzzle, which we have to, get them all nailed down to actually deliver a replicable, scalable model. And the whole point is that we do want this to replicate and scale. So there's lots of things that we can share as outputs from things like our Pathfinder 2 project. So our DNO planning tool, the smart system, the service model. So all those things are things that we're working on now, with the intention that we can work with other communities through kind of a social franchise, because the key is that this has to be a community-centric model. We don't think that it's commercial enough to be picked up and run with by the big boys, but fundamental to the work we're doing is to pass it on to other community groups that have the same ethos as us in terms of that asset ownership and the community and the non-profit extractive model. So yes, what's next? So as I said, we're doing 2 projects. We've got the Pathfinder 2 Net Zero Living, and that's doing a 3-house demonstrator, but it's building all those kind of outputs in terms of the procurement methodology, the operational governance, the templates, the legal templates, the MOUs, the techno-economic model. So we're just improving the package with all these outputs in, and that runs till November next year. And then we've been working with Electricity North West, and that's on all the virtual infrastructure, on the smart stuff. And we've done a Strategic Innovation Fund Discovery, and then we moved on to Alpha, and we're just about to start an NIA, which is the Network Innovation Allowance project with ENWL. And that's working on this kind of operability of the kit with the home energy management system. And then we'll look to do an application for Strategic Innovation Fund Beta in spring next year. And that will be where the home energy management system communicates and interfaces with the community energy management system and the network. So that's a really interesting piece of work that's going on there at the moment. But we want to do 200 homes, and we need to find pilot funding to do 200 homes, but do it in a way that's really sandbox. So actually looking at, working with the universities to look at, well, what is the social impact? What's the improvements in air quality? What could the economic multiplier be? So that's our job now, is to try and find funding for 200 homes. And we're asking government to continue to support the work we're doing. So we've got another fund, which is the DESNZ Local Energy Advice Demonstrator, and that runs out in March. So that's funding 4 of our members of staff at the moment. And what they're doing, as I mentioned earlier, is they're working with health professionals, and that's been really successful, building those relationships with the health professionals and working through their networks to reach people who are vulnerable or who need healthy, warm homes. We're saying to government, okay, well, the Net Zero Living finishes, it's an innovation project, it finishes next November. Where do we go now? Because we've got a lot of knowledge that we want to share, but we need to have the kind of runway funding to make sure that knowledge doesn't dissipate, because people have got to work and they need to find jobs. So we're really talking to government about how do we create this to be a standardized, replicable, scalable model. And how do we streamline the processes? So how can other groups pick up what we're doing, but have the same conversations with investors? So basically matching things like our quality assurance process, and making sure that from a due diligence perspective, investors see housing in Brighton and Toxteth and Bacup and Bridgend, and they can look at that and aggregate their investment across that kind of portfolio of houses. And obviously policy engagement as well. So it's really critical. I think what we're trying to do is uncover the really nitty-gritty issues. So this isn't about concept. It's about actually how do you do this, and what are the assessments processes? I mean, at the moment, because everything's geared towards deep retrofit and things like PAS 2035, it costs thousands of pounds to do assessments on terrace housing, and you just can't scale that up. So we're creating a net zero terrace standard with our rationale for why we're doing what we're doing. And also we're trying to create this kind of local development order for terrace housing. So for example, if you want to put external wall insulation on a terrace gable end, it goes outside the red line boundary, and therefore you have to apply for planning permission as if you were doing an extension. And if you want to do a borehole next to a sewer pipe, there needs to be a 3-metre buffer. So we're unpicking all these problems and saying, okay, well, here's a solution, here's the rationale for that solution, how can we wrap this up? So we're working with Rossendale Borough Council on what that looks like in terms of a suggested local development order that would mop up all these issues to mean that we can streamline and you know, move through faster. And also, yes, I think I said already about the how we can look at policy, things like aggregating the boiler upgrade scheme. For those people that can't do it individually, then can we just aggregate that? Obviously, the Warm Homes Plan coming out as well, so we're really interested to see how that can be applied to area-based retrofit programs. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. So yes, it's about, well, you know, what I say as well to government is, you know, people generally don't care about decarbonising the grid by 2030, which is obviously the government's ambition and the whole point of the Clean Power 2030, etc., etc. But people really do care about having affordable energy and healthy, warm homes and be able to afford their energy bill and not getting a shock. So we've got to flip that narrative, and net zero has to be about people in their homes being comfortable. And it just so happens we're also decarbonising heat, undertaking fabric retrofit, and ensuring that the domestic, you know, demand side flexibility is going to get to people who need it first and fastest. I think as well, it's a key to building resilience within communities. So, you know, the key is here that you're not leaving people behind, and you're trying to create a new social norm. So as it's a bit like broadband, you know, there's going to be early adopters and laggards, but it's become a social norm that people have broadband and they want it and they use it. So we've got to kind of create this new social norm in terms of decarbonised heat as well. And yeah, you know, things like the local power plan have to be a whole system solution, not just generation. It's got to be how it all fits together at that local level. And as I think I've said that, you know, this is about a bread and butter issue. And, you know, Labour should be really focused on the fact that if they want people to be able to afford energy, which is a real bread and butter issue, you know, they have to look at these types of solutions to deliver at scale. Yeah, because if people don't, you know, people have to actively see and benefit from the energy transition. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. I think that's me. Yeah, that's my contact details. And thank you very much for the invite, Philip.